It's 1985 and microcomputers are still king in Europe, but over the pond in North America, well, the Japanese invasion is just about to start in earnest. My name's Stuart, this is Generation Pixel, and welcome to the Pixel Years. Breaking news in 1985, and Coca-Cola release New Coke, which doesn't go down just as well as they expected it to. The future of the car is about to change as the future car, the Sinclair C5, hits the market. The Japanese electronic company giant Nintendo released the Nintendo Entertainment System on an unsuspecting North American public. And finally, YouTube sensation PG Venom 1985 was born in this year, and that is the news from 1985. So hello friends and welcome back to the Pixel Years, and here we are in 1985 and a lot is going to be happening in the world of video games, music and movies. So let's start with the first game we're going to look at from the ZX Spectrum by strapping on as many weapons as humanly possible, tying on a bandana because it's Rambo First Blood Part 2. Now, licensed games tend to get, and rightly so, a bad rap when it comes to movie adaptations to the video game form, and it's often all too easy to see the reasons behind that. One, they spend more money on acquiring the license than they do in the game, and two, there's often a lot of crunch just to get that game out in time for the release of the film itself. But in the 1980s things were just a little bit different, and on occasion you did get a decent license game, and for me, Rambo First Blood Part 2 was definitely one of the better offerings. Perhaps in many ways it's aided by the fact that the movie itself isn't overly complicated, and the game manages to follow the plot quite well because of this. If you recall watching the movie itself, John J. Rambo, our wonderful hero, has to parachute deep behind enemy lines, but of course there's complications and he loses all his kit. The game follows the same plot. You start off as John J. Rambo behind enemy lines and armed with only your knife and some grenades. Now the game itself plays a little bit like a very popular game of the time, Commando, where you have a top-down perspective of your character and mostly you should be moving forward to try and reach your objective, which in this case is exactly like the movie, and that is to rescue the prisoners of war that are still trapped there. Unlike Commando, however, Rambo is just slightly more open world, where with Commando you are just rushing forward. With Rambo there is a bit of exploration to try and find your lost kit. Now of course there's advantages in finding your lost kit. If you find your M60 machine gun, your rocket launcher, your bow and arrow with explosive tips, then the game will be just a tad more easy to complete. But that's not the only way you can play Rambo in the ZX Spectrum. No, you can go full Rambo. And by that I mean you just take your knife, your grenades and run forward as fast as you can, get into that enemy prison camp, release the prisoners and hightail it out of dodge and get to the chopper. So if you're desperate for some of that high octane 80s action, you can do much worse than Rambo on the ZX Spectrum.
Only the heroic Autobots can save Earth. Sideswipe, grapple, ratchet, jazz, a whole army.
Evil Decepticons! Autobots, transform!
Transformers, robots in disguise.
The evil Decepticons must be stopped by the heroic Autobots. The battle goes on.
Transformers,
Robots in Disguise from Hasbro.
Next up for the video games is another ZX Spectrum game, and it's one of the granddaddies of the one-on-one beat-em-up. So step aside Street Fighter for The Way of the Exploding Fists. I think it's very safe to say that in the 1980s there was nothing more popular than martial arts. Whether you were a fan of Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris or just ninjas in general, anything to do with the martial arts was just totally rad. And if you think you had to wait until the first Street Fighter came along to give you one-on-one fighter goodness, then you couldn't be more wrong, because in 1985 we had The Way of the Exploding Fist, and this wasn't even the first one-on-one fighter. It was, however, my favourite one-on-one fighter, and that's because because it wasn't so fast paced. This was a much more tactical game that was much more of a karate sim than it was an arcade beat 'em up. And not only that, this is what we called a one button fighter. Now by one button fighter I quite simply mean that there was one fire button. Each and every separate move was controlled by a direction on the joystick combined with the fire button. Now this was all very well if you did play with a joystick, but back in the ZX Spectrum days I was a keyboard kid. So to play Way of the Exploding Fists I required 9 different keys. And yes, you're probably thinking you've got 10 fingers, that shouldn't be too difficult, but you splay your hands across a keyboard for the directions of up, up left, up right, down, down left, down right, right, left and a fire button, and you'll start to see how complicated that is and just how much skill resided in these fingers back in the 1980s. And it wasn't just having your fingers on the right keys, it was pressing the right combination to pull off the right move at the right time. As I said, this was more of a sim karate game, so you did have to move and counter move with your opponent. And for each opponent you managed to see off, you would move up a dan and move on to a much more difficult opponent. It is, however, in my humble opinion, an absolute work of art, a great game, and one you definitely need to try at least once in your life. Just maybe do yourself a favour though and source yourself a joystick, because the keyboard, well, that's for professionals only.
Lying in the garden, dying of thirst, thought I'd never survive. So the word got round about a cool fruit drink called Britvic 55. 55% pure orange juice with a tingle and a sparkle on top. Fruity, long, refreshing.
Tastes fruity to the very last
Oh,
drop.
it's burning hot in the garden, but I'm starting to revive. With a sparkle and a tingle from a cool fruit drink called Britvic 55.
Now the next game we're going to look at, and yes, still for the ZX Spectrum because we're still deeply embedded in the 1980s, is a game where, well, you're going to need to build up these digits here because you're going to use them a lot in Hypersports. Now there's no getting away from the fact that when Konami released Track and Field in the arcades in 1983, it was going to change the face of gaming. Never before had there been such a competitive game that employed only 3 buttons, which were often fondly referred to as left leg, right leg and jump. And the absolutely phenomenal success that game achieved led to an unbelievable explosion in athletic video games. And in the entirety of this genre, Hypersports was definitely my number 1 go-to athletics game. Now don't get me wrong, I did enjoy the other athletics games that were on the market, such as Daley Thompson's Decathlon. But for reasons that I still can't put my finger on today, Hypersports just had an edge when it came to fun. It's not that it done anything remarkably outstanding compared to the other games, it just seemed to encapsulate just a little bit more of that arcadey fun that we were looking for in our games, especially back in 1985. Now no doubt a big part of the reason that I did love Hypersports was that it was a Konami game. Now yes, Konami may have fallen out of favour in recent years, but back in the day no one could argue that Konami didn't know what they were doing, or for that matter deliver on a regular basis. The lineup of events in Hypersports was also something quite special. There was a wonderful variety of sports to offer, and not only that, they were so well balanced. Where in many of the other athletic games you were faced with multiple events where you had to sprint, Hypersports mixed up the gameplay with various events which required different techniques to master. The swimming event at the start was the main sprint event, but you did have to stop to breathe, so it added an extra dimension to that particular event. Next up came the skeet shoot, and there was nothing more fun than blasting those clay pigeons out of the sky with your double-barreled shotgun. Replacing the more traditional long jump, Hypersports gave us a gymnastic event, one in which after you had jumped you had to keep battering those buttons to spin your little athlete towards a winning distance. The archery event took some real skill because not only did you have to take into consideration the wind, but also a moving target. Next up came the triple jump, which was probably the most standard event in the game, but of course being the triple jump it was 3 times more difficult than just doing a standard long jump. And of course there was the power lifting, the clean and jerk, and of all the events this is probably the toughest one. And for replayability, well, Hypersports nailed it, because after you completed all the events once you went back to the start, but all the targets had increased, so you had to do just that little bit better the next time. So if you are thinking about playing an athletics game from the 1980s, especially in an 8-bit micro, then you could do far worse than Konami's Hypersports.
attention mounts as the East-West talks go into their second session.
Answer the question, comrade, if you please. What was Julius Marx more commonly known as?
Carl?
No. Groucho.
Well, here's one for your arms expert. What's the tooth on Popeye's arm?
Gentlemen, enough, please. The Star Wars question. Who was Luke Skywalker's father?
Trivial pursuit. 6,000 questions of no vital importance whatsoever.
Now the next game for the ZX Spectrum that we're going to have a look at is well embedded in this particular time era, and that is none other than the famous and infamous Raid Over Moscow. Now the 1980s wouldn't be the 1980s without some sort of Cold War reference. The threat of nuclear holocaust hung over our heads like a dark cloud for most of the 80s, and of course it was going to seep into video games, and one such video game is Raid Over Moscow. And Raid Over Moscow is one of the finest examples of a ZX Spectrum game that you can play. Firstly, it has a simple storyline. The story in this case is that the West has lost their entire nuclear arsenal and are now at the mercy of the communist threat. Luckily for us, of course, the USA has an elite squadron of aircraft that they can launch off of orbital platforms to neutralise the Russian missiles before they're even launched. As for the game itself, it's split into several different stages, which is a classic 8-bit microcomputer trope. In the first stage, you have to get your aircraft off the orbital carrier, which can be quite tricky because it does use zero gravity physics. Very clever for 1985 and quite tricky to control until you get used to it. In the second stage, you have to speed along the Russian landscape, avoiding jet fighters, tanks and other obstacles that are there to stop you. In the third stage, you're taking on the missile silo itself, in a static vertical shooter that also requires you to adjust the height of your aircraft. And if you complete these 3 stages for each city that has a silo, you get to then move on to the proper Raid Over Moscow and take on the Red Capital itself, where armed with your rocket launcher you will breach the Kremlin. And once inside the Kremlin, well, there's one more job. Take down the evil robot that's controlling everything by playing a Tron-like game where you bounce a discus off the back of the wall and try to hit the rear of the robot. And if you manage to do that, you're the saviour of Western civilization, which is a feat that I've not in over 40 years been able to achieve. Now I'm not too ashamed about that, because if you think NES is hard, then you need to try some 8-bit microcomputer games, and Raid Over Moscow is certainly one that you should try. Now the next game we're going to have a look at is another well-beloved game, and beloved not just by me but by so many people back in 1985 and even onwards, and that game is Skool Daze. Now I've talked about mundane jobs in video games in the past, but who would have thought in the mid-80s I would be rushing home from school along with a whole host of other school children just to play a game about being in school. Now let me just say this, that straight off the bat, Skool Daze is probably one of the all-time classics on the ZX Spectrum. It's a game that wasn't just loved by the players, but it was also critically acclaimed. And also, and rightly so, credited with being one of the pioneers of sandbox gaming. Now the premise of Skool Daze is quite simple. You play as the game's hero, Eric in this case, and you have one simple task, which is to get into the headmaster's safe and deal quite promptly with your terrible report card. Now to do so, it's not just a case of getting into the headmaster's office, opening the safe and taking out the offending report card. To open the safe, you have to highlight all the plaques that are on the wall in the school. and to do so you must hit them with your catapult, or slingshot if you're one of my North American viewers. Now a few of the plaques are quite simple to hit. All you have to do is walk up a couple of stairs, turn fire, and it will highlight the plaque. Not every plaque however is in range, and to get those plaques, well, this is what you have to do. You will have to shoot a teacher who will fall to the ground, then shoot again, and the catapult shot will ricochet off his head and up towards the plaque. Now that all being said, this would still be quite a simple game, but unfortunately the game is named School Days and you are stuck in here for your school day, which means when the bell goes you have to go to the assigned classroom, because if you don't go to the assigned classroom you will be assigned lines, because not doing what you're told in school is regarded as naughty, and being naughty in school, especially in the 80s, often meant the mundane punishment of having to write lines. And it's lines in this game that we have to pay attention to, because that's where your lives are in this game. Because once you reach 10,000 lines you get suspended, sent home, and there's no way for you to get into that safe and remove that incriminating report card. Now simply not turning up to your class will get you lines, but there's many more ways to get lines in the game. For example, you have to shoot the teachers, and if you get caught doing this you will receive lines. Also you have other classmates getting into mischief along the way, and if you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you'll accumulate their lines too. One of the most frustrating ways to get lines is to end up in a classroom that doesn't have enough seats, because if this happens there's a domino effect where each and every student gets up and tries to take your seat, knocking you to the floor. If you're caught sitting on the floor, it's lines. And let me tell you, in this game there is just so many ways to get lines, it's unbelievable. But the absolute creme de la creme moment in School Days is right at the beginning, where you get to choose the characters' names. That's right, you can name any of the main characters in the game, which meant you could put in your name, your friends' names, and your most hated teachers' names. This is a must play on a ZX Spectrum, so if you do get the opportunity, go get some School Days.
We built this city on rock and roll.
Maybe get a pistol on your little finger. Maybe get a blister on your thumb. Don't you forget about me.
So there you go my friends, that was 1985 in the pixel years, that glorious mid-decade year experienced through the eyes of yours truly. Now, did you have any of the same experiences back in 1985? Were you just born like, well, PJ Venom 1985 back in 1985? Anything that you want to talk about that you've seen in this video, well, you drop that down there in the comments, because the interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes this series special. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to watch the rest of the series if you haven't seen it already. And until next time, of course, cheerio!
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? The first to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot. Batteries not included. He follows the commands you put on the screen, so you get to the dynamite before it explodes. Will you be the one to raise the incredibly accurate zapper and play games like Duck Hunt? Will you be the one to experience the Nintendo Entertainment System? Comes with Rob, zapper, control deck, 2 controllers, gyromite, and Duck Hunt.